Hi, everyone. Welcome to Paying Attention, a regular conversation between me and my friend Nicholas Gruen. I'm Peyton Bowman.
And here am I with my trusty pot and cup of green tea.
Yeah, well, it's great to see you. So this week, I thought we could talk a little bit about a topic you raised on your Twitter feed. You posted a link, or actually a quote, by William James, and you I believe titled it "James on Zelenskyy." Maybe you could tell people a little bit about that quote and what it was all about.
I will, and it's I was just thinking earlier, it is about a week. I think when we last recorded a message, we didn't know the name Volodymyr Zelenskyy, or we would have heard it on the news, but it didn't really. He wasn't a household word and or a household name, and it was electrifying when I first saw those videos of his, the incredible courage, and it put me in mind of an essay by, or a speech initially by the great American philosopher William James, and I used it in a long essay, or in an essay of mine on different ways of knowing, but the essay is called "The Will to Believe," and it's James dealing. Well, not that I want to get into this today, but he's dealing with the question of faith in our lives, and by faith he does mean religious faith, but he also means the faith that you and I had in each other to each turn up on this platform at the same time, the faith that we have that the words that we're using are conveying something of what we're saying, the way in which our lives are saturated with faith, and the incredibly, and the fact that like a fish doesn't know that it's swimming in water, we don't appreciate how much this is a building block of our lives and how necessary it is to lead a healthy and a happy life. So without further ado, he said, with lots of ado, I'll now read you the passage. Any social organism of any sort whatever, large or small, is what it is because each member proceeds to his own duty with a trust that the other members will simultaneously do theirs. Wherever a desired result is achieved by the cooperation of many independent persons, the existence as a fact is pure consequence of the precursive faith in one another of those immediately concerned. A government, an army, a commercial system, a ship, a college, an athletics team, all exist on this condition, without which not only is nothing achieved, but nothing is even attempted. And if that isn't clear enough as to why Zelenskyy conjures up for me that passage, I'll make it more specific by reading on. Yeah. A whole train of passengers, individually brave enough, will be looted by a few highwaymen simply because the latter can count on one another, while each passenger fears that if he makes a movement of resistance, he will be shot before anyone else backs him up. There are then cases where a fact cannot come at all unless a preliminary faith exists in its coming.
Yeah. That's a really interesting example there. I mean, it takes the whole idea of a trust fall and puts it in a different light, don't you think, when you're...
It does, and it's like, to quote an economist called G.L.S. Shackle in around about the 1970s, a Keynesian economist who talked about the importance of expectations, coined this expression, the world is kaleidic. And that is the idea that you're looking through the world, it all looks pretty grim, and certainly I thought things were looking pretty grim. I've been thinking things have been pretty grim on a number of dimensions for a while now, and getting grimmer. And then a little crystal shifts and you turn the barrel a little, and then you can see not just the seeds of optimism, but everything looks different. And Zelenskyy was like that. Zelenskyy said, fuck you, I'm happy to die if I have to. and that's the ultimate thing that we all can choose to do, and it's a silly thing to be at all flip about it. But we're all going to die, so, it's not the worst thing in the world, as it were. We'll leave that. I'll let that hang in the air. It's all of those things that just thrilled me about what Zelenskyy did, and then how I think it's already had a material impact of massive proportions. I'll defend that if you would like, just to let you get a word in edgeways.
Yeah, I do think no. I mean, not to attack it, but I'm kind of curious. I mean, in terms of understanding the mechanics behind this, So I think in let's say the ancient world, we might have imagined there are these there's this whole idea of a great man theory of history, right? So there are certain people, they are related to the gods, they have special charisma, they have special powers, special rights to rule over others, perhaps because of their relationship to the divine, let's say. But
let me just hang on. Let me just interrupt you there. Hold your thought and keep asking it after I just interpolate something which I find of interest, and you may too, and you may already know it. That word charisma means gift, and it's the same word. It's the same root word as thank you in Greek, and it's the same root word as Eucharist. So the Eucharist is passing the charisma down from one of the gods. Just a thought. Press on.
No, it's an interesting point. So, I mean, and that's an interesting thing, because at one level you could say, well, Zelensky's a man with incredible charisma. There are a lot of people who have a lot of charisma. I mean, Hollywood, for example, is full of them. So what is it about this decision, that this individual decision, which let's say we'll assume for the moment has no connection to any sort of divine sort of action, but it's just a human decision. Yeah. And what is it about this particular decision that changes the collective reality for the people?
I'm hoping that it's not too connected to charisma. I mean, it's fantastic that he's charismatic, and I'm trying to think of counterexamples, but I can't, because Churchill was very charismatic. I think perhaps a counterexample is a little bit Abraham Lincoln, who wasn't charismatic until you got into the vibe of the thing, as it were, until you started listening to the cadences and you started noticing that this thing came from the depths, as it were. So I think that the thing that made the difference was not Zelensky's charisma, which was obviously powerful and helped to radiate what he did. It was his courage, and it was his, as we can now see in retrospect, and perhaps he can only see in retrospect, his dedication to fighting bullshit and diplomacy and what you're going to do and how you're going to be tough. I mean, remember the first set of sanctions that came out, all the Europeans were running around saying these are the strongest sanctions we've ever imposed on anyone. And good old Vladimirovich Putin was going, good, that's just what I planned. And then someone called bullshit, and he did so in a way that we could tell wasn't bullshit, because he said, well, I might die doing this, and I could not die, but I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. So that's what he did. And when I saw it, I sort of thought, well, this is just wonderful. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. And then about a day or two later, I had a conversation with a friend about the new set of sanctions that had been imposed, most particularly the freezing of the assets of the Bank of Russia, the Russian central bank, which is in the process of crippling the Russian economy. And that's arguably, it's all Zelenskyy. It's all the man in the with the highwayman, and he got up and he ran at the highwayman, and people had enough time to do something about it. So that's what he did. And I actually want to it's obvious that the obvious word, the cliched word, and the true word is that what he did was inspirational. But I want to encounter it at a much more prosaic level. All he did was to do what a leader should do in that situation. All he did was do what John Smith, I think his name was, who was the captain of the Titanic, did, which is he went down with his ship, and he was a hero because that's a heroic thing to do, but he also knew that if he got home, he could never show his face in public. That was just an utterly shameful thing to do. And of course, it's doing the opposite of that now is so normalized that the American embassy ring up and say, we've set up a ride for you to run away. They don't even say, gee, it's a lot for us to ask because we're not the ones dying, but would you mind staying there because it'd actually be better for your cause. So everything was topsy-turvy. And so Zelenskyy reminds us that we can step out of this world of dysfunction and on our own step into a possible alternative world, and then everybody gets it and goes, yeah, we know that world. We got told stories about that world. We live in that world on particular days when people honour each other and do the right thing. And so this transformation takes place. It's complete. Now that is inspiring. That is completely mind-blowing, I think.
Yeah. It's an interesting way of looking at it. So basically by doing his duty, or at least what we think his duty should be, that in and of itself is a condition for showing courage, creating inspiration in others.
It's a connection. So what's happening there, one of the things that's happening there is that he's just a little individual like we hear in our little post-Enlightenment modern world. And there is this other thing which is called our culture, which connects people together. And his action is the action of an individual operating in harmony with their culture, not with their pure individual interests, and thus enriching everyone in the process, including himself. As Churchill said at the end of a long 5-day cabinet meeting when he just become Prime Minister, and he was dealing with Halifax and Chamberlain and two other war cabinet ministers. Two or three of these guys wanted Halifax to travel to Rome to negotiate with Mussolini, some sort of peace with Hitler. And he faced them down over 5 days. He cajoled them. He bullied them. He did everything he could. And then at the end of this process, he said, well, gentlemen, he said, I'm sure I speak for us all when I say that I would, if the Germans overrun this country, or I'd rather be lying dead in the gutter with blood running out of my neck. You can imagine, Neville Chamberlain thinking, oh, yes, Winston. And so by act of will, by act of charisma, by act of courage, Churchill's crazy, brave, Zelensky-esque courage, he transforms things. But I think that Zelenskyy has done much more because Churchill was already Prime Minister and the British were already dug in, and some sort of peace with Hitler wouldn't have lasted for very long. And anyway, so I think ultimately they were, at least with the benefit of hindsight, the British were going to win that war. Even though it certainly didn't look like it at the time. Whereas this one, I think, could easily have just been, Ukraine could have been gobbled up, dismembered. Maybe it will be with a lot more bloodshed. So there you are. That's the other side of it. Maybe you should have not shown us any of those heroics and fewer people would have been killed. But I was completely thrilled by what he did, and I've now shamefully forgotten the question you asked or the comment that you made before I went on this rant.
Yeah, well, I think it all illustrates to some degree the point that, and I want to dig a little bit into this idea of, I think you said earlier, doing what he should do as a leader, doing his duty as a leader.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of interested in the dynamic here, because when I think of, let's say, doing a duty or doing a role, especially one that's involved in running a country or leading a people, I'm often, think a little bit, let's say, about Aristotle's Politics, the idea of, eudaimonia, like happiness that's generated by doing something, by fulfilling a role in a particular way. And it's sort of this, it's almost like this generative process of doing the
absolutely
right thing.
It is. Not almost, I think it is.
Virtuous reaction to events. So that, and then on the other hand, I think you can consider a model of courage that's a kind of form of restraint, let's say. So for example, or any kind of duty, it's almost like an idea of restraint. So if a bear is coming chasing at me, the courage sort of, okay, I'm not going to run away from this bear because, well, for whatever the consequences that may be, I have to stop myself from that initial instinct.
Yeah.
So, but I think that there's, and I wanted to kind of draw a link in trying to dig into this idea a little bit between another piece you wrote about, and you shared with me about different kinds of knowing, the idea of sympathy, the idea of faith, and the way in which knowledge and feeling are shared by a community. And so in the sense that if you see, let's say, I think there's a sense in which, and I don't know if this is the right way of putting it per se, but Zelenskyy, in exercising his role, and I'm sure it's very difficult and unpleasant in many, many different ways, but there's also has to be a sense of pleasure, in a sense of being proper.
I mean, Churchill you just couldn't have made the guy happier. In fact, it was Churchill who said he gave a talk to his old school, Harrow, and they introduced him and they said, these are, we're so grateful to have our Prime Minister and no doubt they said inspiration in these dark times. You remember what how he pulled them up and he said, these are not dark times, these are stern times, these are sublime times. We are called to be present at we now call it a hinge moment. We are here at the centre of all that matters, all that has ever, at a moment of immense, immense significance for the world, for Europe, for the species. These are sublime times. He kept using the word sublime. He uses the word sublime when he talks about we will fight them on the beaches. He talks about the sublime French who've made an absolute balls up of the whole thing, of course. And I would expect that, it's easy for me to say, isn't it? So, but a man like that is thinking, good, might be better if I was 65 and not 45, but if I have to die, I could do worse. And that's what Churchill just loved, the idea of dying some glorious death.
Yeah, well, it does sound a little bit out of keeping with contemporary mores, I guess.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right.
So.
But that's why the Captain of the Titanic is really a lovely story, because it is there are lots of things we wouldn't have liked about that world, but that's something about that world, which is you just don't come home. You put your money where your mouth is, and you're doing everything you can to stop that ship going down. And we know there are no conflicts of interest between the ship and you. And that's kind of good for the passengers to know. That's my point. I presume that idea is not would not be the case with a cargo ship, and it's not the case if you get all the passengers off the ship. But and so this brings it down. The idea of a kind of humdrum heroism is a powerful one. The idea that at bottom a culture simply expects certain things to happen. And of course, this does happen in the army. In the army, people are just constantly drilled, not to be heroes for no reason, but that they are drilled about this line when they say, right, I have to dig in and I have to do everything I can here, including at great risk to myself.
Yeah. So, well, I guess in a way, to get back to this other question, then, what is... Well, no, but I think
I'm dragging this thing towards heroism. You go, Payne.
Well, no, because I do think all these points are absolutely fundamental to the discussion and to understanding this kind of leadership, which we haven't seen. Let's say it's not something we're used to seeing very much.
Yeah, it certainly isn't. Yeah.
So, but what is it? What is the mechanism then that makes this mean something to? I mean, to people in Ukraine, I think it's certainly obviously, well, I don't know. First of all, how does this mechanism of a courageous leader affect the people in the country, for example? But why is it also affecting us? Why is it also affecting the other foreign powers who are putting sanctions on Russia for this act? I mean, so how is this kind of viral in a sense? Or what is it about?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and I would like to invite you, if you want to explain to me what you explained earlier, which is the distinction between an idea of a society with the managers as the head and the brain, or the prime minister as the head and the brain of an organization, as opposed to another way of thinking about it. And that would be, I think that would be a great way, if you can explain that, that would be a great way that we can then take the conversation further.
Sure. So, earlier I brought up the idea of how we think of organizations and the metaphor of the organization as a human body. So this is a metaphor that's used a lot in literature throughout the centuries. And probably the most famous kind of iteration of this idea appears in the New Testament, so in which Paul is talking about the church and how the church, members of the church all serve a different function, like the hands or the feet or the body, and then that human body sort of becomes this church, which is also the bride of Christ. So there's this kind of anthropomorphization, I don't know the word, but of anthropomorphization.
Yeah, that was right. Anthropomorphization. Yep, I think that's right.
Something like that. So
it's certainly anthropomorphic. So go with that.
But I think in contemporary times, if we sort of imagine this metaphor, we'd say, okay, well then, who's that head of the body? Who's doing the thinking? And that's the leader. That's the real, I suppose. That's where you would want to be. Let's say if you could choose to be part of this body. But it calls to mind an earlier version of this, which appears in Livy, and
the Roman historian Livy. Go on.
That's correct. Yeah. So Livy.
I don't say that as if I know Livy particularly well. I'm just saying that because I do know that much.
But he's writing about the history of the Roman people, and he is writing about a conflict that took place at the beginning of the 5th century, when basically it was a kind of very early version of a strike. There were two general classes of people: the patricians, who were the aristocratic group, and the plebeians, who are the people involved in labor, essentially. And at one point, the plebeians thought, we're doing all this work for this aristocratic group and we don't get enough back, so we're just going to leave. And so they all, not all of them, but a large chunk of them left the city, went over a river, the River Anio, and set up camp and just started living there. And they were kind of just camping out there. And according to the story, the Roman...
And they were missed. Their contribution was missed.
And the Senate was particularly concerned about security, which is actually kind of an interesting parallel to what's in a way going on in Russia. But they were worried about dividing the country and making them essentially vulnerable to outside conquest, or they also didn't have enough people to do the work that they wanted to do. So they sent out a guy named Agrippa Menenius, who was born to the plebeian class, but who was associated with the patricians. And he went out to speak to them, and he used this kind of metaphor of the body. But instead of describing the Senate or the aristocratic group, this patrician group, as the head, he just talks about them being the stomach. So all the people, he says, I have the quote here, and he gives this kind of parable or a kind of fable. In the days when man's arms and legs and his did not agree amongst themselves, as is now the case, but had each in its own ideas and a voice of its own, the other parts thought it unfair that they should have the worry and the trouble and the labor of providing everything for the belly, while the belly remained quietly in their midst, with nothing to do but enjoy the good things that were bestowed upon it. They therefore conspired together that the hands should carry no food to the mouth, nor the mouth accept anything that was given to it, nor the teeth grind up what they had received. While they sought in this angry spirit to starve the belly into submission, the members themselves and the whole body were reduced to the utmost weakness. Hence it had become clear that even the belly had no idle task to perform, and was no more nourished than it nourished the rest, by giving out to all parts of the body that by which we live and thrive, when it has been divided equally amongst the veins and is enriched with digested food, that is, the blood. So his point, in a way, is that in some sense that it's not, I guess, completely clear, and maybe there was a sense of the body in which the Romans thought of the stomach as having a kind of, like some of the functions of the mind, which it actually is. I think we found that the gut, for example, plays an important role in the human nervous system. But in any case, the stomach sort of somehow nourishes every other part of the body, and the body has to work together, each according to its own function, in order that it's expected of it, in order to, maintain health, maintain strength. And it's as Livy says, the plebeians were convinced by this argument. So I think from our contemporary view, it seems like a kind of insulting idea. Well, we're just doing it to.
Well, you could use it in contemporary. You could use it in a contemporary speech to say how fat and lazy the stomach is.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not what is meant.
Yeah. But so I guess that the idea, and there's more of a tacit relationship in a sense, as I think you wrote about, between these, rather than the mental sort of, the brain decides on a purpose, and all the parts of the body are working together towards a common purpose, a common end.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fantastic kind of reversal of the metaphor, because in our post-Enlightenment state, we are greatly given to the idea, just as vision is a kind of massively overrepresented in our sense of the senses. We say things like "I can see this" and so on. In the same way, thinking is this thing that the brain we think does, and of course it. The secret is it doesn't do it on its own. It's not like a little central processing unit. It's distributed in various ways. But we think of this process of thinking as the central, most important thing. And that's wrong, I think. And so I can think of two or three philosophers whose language helps one see this. You used the word tacit, and of course I've sort of done quite a lot of reading around a philosopher called Michael Polanyi, who was greatly taken with this idea that what we take to be our explicit knowledge, which is, things like E equals MC squared, or the earth goes around the sun, this is knowledge that can be encoded in words and exchanged between people. His idea of that is that knowledge actually doesn't exist except built on a very deep layer upon layer of tacit knowledge. So if you tell a baby that E equals mc squared, it's not going to work. If you tell a baby or a 2-year-old that the sun goes round, that the Earth goes round the sun, they can start to kind of understand that, but not very much. And learning to speak, learning to write, learning to throw a ball, learning to walk, these require months and months and years of practice, and this is the tacit layer. And in that sense, the stomach might be a much better metaphor, or at least a metaphor to balance this idea of the brain as the dominant and organizing organ. Another one is Adam Smith, who, of course, is famous for writing The Wealth of Nations, and for in the moderns will often see him as valorizing, as validating or legitimating self-interest as the thing which is the centrally important thing that helps the world go round. But of course, that was The Wealth of Nations, and there's another book that he wrote 17 years before called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and that was about sympathy, the fact that we have sympathetic relations with each other. And of course, I use that word sympathetic because it hopefully conjures up a broader range of associations than just sympathy. Oh dear, the sympathetic nervous system and so on. And then, of course, there's William James, who we've also talked about, which is this idea that we are connected through faith. We're connected through faith in each other. We're connected through faith that the words that I'm mysteriously pulling out of my head or wherever I'm pulling them out of line up in such a way that they mean something clear to me and that they can travel to you. That's all faith. And it's all faith between the tacit layer and the explicit layer, and then between me and you. And it's all shows of faith in all the English speakers of the world, because that's where we got that's where we got the body of material that we're constantly drawing from. So yes, that idea is that when you told me about Agricola Menius, I'm not sure, what is it? Agrippa, yes, and then I called him Agricola previously, but I have written down Agrippa below it. I'll cross out Agricola. Agrippa, I thought, yep, that's a terrific addition to, if you're looking for metaphors, well, it's right up there with the brain as a way of thinking about this, and rather better at explaining how the stomach ends up with quite so much of the gets, at least in human society, quite so much of the loot.
Yeah. Well, I do think it is an interesting metaphor, and I wrote one piece a while ago about it. I think there is still an interesting. It raises a lot of questions, though, in a sense. So why does for example, the hands and the feet? So the stomach's main job is to distribute blood, but if the hands and the feet give more blood than the teeth or the nose, I don't know. So how does the body, how does that decide? But it's not decided by, again, our idea of justice is the idea that we have someone, kind of making all the plans at the top of an organization.
Yeah.
And it decides, so this guy's going to get, $2,000 a month, and this woman's going to get $3,000 a month, and this guy over here, because I like him, he's going to get, $100,000 a month. And so then it's like, well, that's a real question of justice, right? So this decision, this conscious decision that this person has, in a sense, discriminated against these other two people for reasons that were, due to self-interest. Whereas the stomach, by some sort of operation that's not 100% clear, actually really, in a way, kind of focusing more on the function of each of the body parts and deciding that they need these sorts of resources versus other parts of the body which need less resources to do their job. The teeth, for example, maybe teeth don't need blood to function once they're made, right? So it's interesting to kind of dig
yeah, that's right. And bodies are put together in this extraordinary way. Again, a bit like, now I'll make another analogy, which is when we learn the tacit routines that help us walk. Well, nature had to evolve these routines that work out that the teeth don't need much blood, except on certain occasions they do, and so it's made this unbelievably complex organism, or evolved this unbelievably complex organism, and it actually is one of the reasons why it won't yield to our clumsy intellection, to our clumsy attempts to try to reduce it. It won't yield in any sense. It won't. It won't yield in a medical sense. I mean, there are things that it does yield. We invent penicillin, or we discover penicillin, and it does an amazing number of things. But now we're bumping up against all kinds of chronic diseases, and they all seem to be multi-causal. And this hope that we had that the genome would allow us to get to the bottom of things. Well, that was one hell of a complicated bottom of things, because there are millions of these damn genes and bits and constituents of the genes, and they get switched on and off, and there's all this junk DNA that we have no idea what's going on. So it really mocks our reason, and it's 3 cheers for us, or 2 cheers for us for having got as far as we've got, but it's just, this is billions of years of evolution. I guess we shouldn't be surprised. It's pretty tough stuff. I'll just say one other thing, which I think which sort of hangs in my mind quite a lot, which is that it's a very common practice for managers to imagine that it is more objective. It's obviously better, more systematic. If you're going to interview candidates, you might have a meeting beforehand or a process where you say, we're going to mark this candidate on these 4 categories, these 4 major categories, each of which have got subcategories, and one is, ability, and another is application, and another is experience, let's say. And so they agree in principle how much they're going to mark these things, how much each of these things matter to them. And it's just a silly, I think, maybe there are circumstances, but since everyone does it, I'm sure there is, it's got some sort of procedural logic, at least it starts conversations. But it's a ridiculously incomplete way to think about these things. It's certainly a way to make sure that you never pick up Steve Jobs as your CEO, because he's out, knocks a couple of these things out of the park and gets about 5% for some of the others. But a more telling way to make my point is to say to you, Peyton, what's your favourite organ? Well, they've all got to work together. Things that we just don't care about that much. The pituitary gland, well, you've got to have it going. The only thing you can get rid of is the odd appendix and a spleen and things, but most of your organs you can't do without. And so your lungs and your heart and your kidneys and kidneys we can now do without. But anyway, that's my point. You can't, it's a sort of, you kid yourself if you say, oh, well, lungs are definitely 40% and the heart's 20%. Yeah. Well, you try doing without a heart. It's not going to work.
Yeah. But
brain, etc.
Yeah. Well, so to bring this discussion back full circle, because I think maybe we'll have a few more minutes to talk. But So when we look at Zelenskyy, what he's doing, what in a way, I think it strikes me that one of the things that makes his what he's done inspirational is that he is, he is taking on the duties, in a sense, of, let's say, the ordinary soldier or the ordinary person. And, I think that that's a really inspirational part of politics. It's part of what made Trump appealing. He sort of sold himself as an ordinary person, right?
With his Big Macs.
Yeah, with his Big Macs.
His hamburgers. I don't know whether they were Big Macs. They were certainly hamburgers anyway.
Bill Clinton was the one who went to McDonald's too, But anyway, the whole point is more though. So what? That certainly is energizing. It's like, the stomach, in a sense, in that way, he doesn't necessarily need to have that role, that action, but to kind of take on the is it the roles, is it the responsibilities of the soldier, or is it the dangers that they face, or what is it that, because he could have just left and he could have set up one of these governments abroad, and he could have run this operation from there, and it would have been safer in some senses, and other leaders have done this.
And also you could argue it's actually better for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you could argue that this is reckless and that he should have done this. It's what other leaders have done in the past.
Yeah.
But I think we both agree that it has created a different kind of response by staying. So what is it? Is it the responsibility, the role of the other, let's say taking on the role of the hand or the foot, or is it the danger that they face, or what is the aspect?
Well, to me, I can only give a very personal answer, and to me, it is that he cut through the acres of bullshit that we live through. The European Union diplomats and statespeople were already bullshitting about the toughest sanctions and all this sort of stuff. Now, he does. So you can see and touch, as it were, reality. You can see and touch the reality that he is representing, and it is such a shock to see the difference between the reality the others are representing. Now, I don't know whether, things were different just in terms of physical courage in 1940 with Winston Churchill, but when Winston Churchill was disgraced in World War I for his pretty ordinary performance, it looks like he came up with the Gallipoli campaign, which any viewers in Australia will be very familiar with, a massive cock-up. And he can argue it wasn't his fault. But anyway, so in 1916, you know what he did when he I don't know whether he was booted out or whether he retired as First Lord of the Admiralty. I think that was his position. You know what he did then? He went to the front. He spent 3 months in the trenches. Now, that's good enough for me. So he doesn't have to prove that. He wanted to prove himself crazy brave the whole time. Whenever he was flying to North Africa to meet de Gaulle, he'd ask his pilots to fly over the front, and they'd say no, Prime Minister. And he was foolhardily brave in South Africa as a journalist. He doesn't have to prove that all the time, but we know that it's not bullshit. When he says we will fight them on the beaches, we will fight them on the landing grounds, we will fight them on the sea and in the air, and so on it goes. Yeah. We know we're not being bullshitted. And that's a bigger problem today than it was then. When he's giving his speech about fighting on the beaches, that is 28 years after the sinking of the Titanic, when a captain went down with his ship. And I guess it was pretty much the same then. So that, to me, is what Zelenskyy did. And then this sort of sniff of hope, this sniff of possibility, this sniff of the better side of our nature makes the thing, and his charisma makes the thing take off. Yeah. Because otherwise he could have been a very courageous, odd sort of little curmudgeon who just sort of gives a talk and it's all very horrible and pathetic, and he gets blown up by a missile there and then, and everyone just gets depressed. That's the thing. That's somewhere in James as well, in William James as well, that faith is a risk. Faith is taking a risk. It's always taking a risk, and if it isn't, it's not faith.
Yeah, and maybe it has something to do too. If he'd gone and created a government in exile, he would have been and hoped that Europe and America and all these other, he could sort of diplomatically arrange sanctions against Russia or something along these lines. Yeah, he would have been saying, "I'm not part of this body, Ukraine. I'm part of this bureaucratic, European body."
That's right. That's right. I'm part of the kingdom of words.
Yeah.
I'm an exile from the kingdom of deeds. I'm coming to you. My voice is coming to you from the kingdom of words. And we've had enough words. We've had it up to absolute here with words.
Well, yeah, I think that sums it up really well. And I think, let's hope that things really work out
Yeah.
that
Well,
comes.
you did mention, and we could have ended on the inspiring note that I've just given you, or we can end up. But I think I'd like to also end on your point, and I'm not quite sure, but I wrote down the word prudence, and that was intimated in one of the stories you were telling. And I'm not. Do you remember when I was? You didn't use the word prudence, but a sort of care. And maybe this was Agrippa was referring to the importance of the Senate in exercising caution. I'm not sure what it was, but that's the other thing. So we're now at risk of getting so carried away that we don't exercise prudence, as if we couldn't manage to blow up 1 billion people. So this is just immensely difficult, and I'm more grateful than I can possibly say for Mr. Zelenskyy. And we have to keep our wits about us. It's the brain stuff now, I suppose. But it's also the body, and it's prudence. And we really have to try hard and not just get carried away.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So, well, we'll just, we'll be very grateful for good leadership in times like these, and we'll do also our best to be part of a better world. And I think, a new order is kind of emerging, and we're going to see, hopefully it'll be run by the best of our people, best of our abilities.
Just a bit more truth-telling will do. I've got my sights just quite modestly on a little more truth-telling, and we've talked about that in a number of these, in a number of our talks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been great talking.
Thank you.
We'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Payton.
All right.